All right, here we go. It's getting a little crazy. So, one thing that I found is that confidence level versus confidence interval apparently is an important thing for us to be able to understand the difference between those two things. Because the College Board on the AP test, they have some multiple choice questions that differentiate between you understanding what confidence level means and how to interpret a confidence interval. They have also had it as a free response question where you had where it asked you to interpret the confidence level. And most of the time, when we do a panic model, we do this interval here. We do the interpretation of the interval. Well, the question on the AP free response asked for you to interpret the confidence level, and that threw a lot of the students off. They just gave the phrase that they know for interval. And so I want to make sure that we know both of those situations and we know to look for the key words of level versus interval. So here we go. So first thing, when we talk about how confident we're going to, or the confidence level, of course we know that references how confident you are asked to be. Okay, so how confident you are asked to be. But it also has to do with, of all of this particular intervals that are made, we're wondering, the proportion of those intervals that contain the true parameter. The true, in our case, we've been dealing with proportions, the true p. So of all of those intervals, the percent of them that contain the true p. All right, so that's what we're interested in. So a phrase that you would say, here's an example of the phrase you would say if you were asked to explain what 95% confidence means. So 95% confidence would mean, and actually let me give you a visual before we even start that. So here is example of, this is our picture of all of the intervals that we had made. Okay, so what we are essentially saying is that of these are all 95% confidence intervals. So we are saying 95% of all of the 95% confidence intervals, because that's what these are, contain the true proportion of water that was on the globe. Okay, so that's what we were attempting to say, and that is the interpretation that you would say for for a confidence level. So here's an example: 95% of all the 95% confidence intervals. Those have to coincide. You can't mix and match. It's kind of like common denominator. You can't mix and match 95% confidence intervals with 80% confidence intervals with, different ones. They have to be all the same there. Stick in there so it doesn't go cold. Okay, so 95% of all of the 95% intervals will contain that true thing that we're looking for. Okay, and so again, that's what our picture was showing here. 95% of these things is going to contain the true. Now, we don't know what that true P is. We're just kind of hypothesizing. Maybe, and I'm going to draw a true P in here because I don't really know. So what I had found here, remember that was the true P that I had found went through the most of our intervals last week. Okay, next, let's talk about confidence interval. So our interval is saying this. Of course, that's our computation of an interval based off of the P hat that you got. Okay, that's that computation of the interval based off of the P hat that you got. And then the typical phrase has to do with, and that's what we say at the end of our panic model. So that's our conclusion that we draw. We say, for example, I am 95% confident that the true proportion of whatever the context is, water on the globe, that's what we did last week. I'm 95% confident that the true proportion of water on the globe is between this number and this number, this percent and this percent. Okay, so that's your typical interval statement. And that's the statement that we write most frequently. Okay, so that one I typically don't have to practice with you because it's one that is stated a lot. But the other one, the confidence level, which is not the interval statement, but the confidence level, that one is harder to remember. So therefore, we have a song for that. Right. Okay, so again, that's your confidence level song because interval we say all the time, but I need you to also know how to interpret it confidence level and watch for somebody saying, what does 95% confidence level mean? All right, the next saying is based on those sayings, we want to know, we want to be able to look at some very carefully phrased statements and see what's correct, what's right or wrong about them. So let's take a look at the first one, and we're going to walk through these one at a time and talk about what's right and wrong on them. So here we go. So, oops, I already told you the first one's true. Giveaway. Give away the answer there. All right, so the first one says, we are 95% confident that the true proportion of voters in favor of Presidential Pete is between 44 and 50.5%, okay? So that's pretty much a straight definition of what we've already said, how to interpret the interval. So that one's good to go. It's all nice, no problem. Now, I'm going to tell you that I'm going to essentially kind of be teaching these to you because I know the first year when I went to the workshop that I got this from, and I read all these, the teacher said, okay, read all of these and see which ones are right and wrong and so on and so forth. And I was like, sounds good to me, sounds good to me. And I didn't know there was, I mean, it just is, it's very detail oriented. So she kind of had to teach us what was bad about them. And so that's kind of what I'm going to do with you. So this first one says, there is a 0.95 or 95% probability that the true proportion of voters in favor of Presidential Pete is between 44% and 50.5%. So this 44 to 55, that's an interval that we had made from a p-hat. Okay, so that's our sample interval. All right, so this says there's a 95% probability that the true p is in the interval that you found, your p-hat interval. And that's a non-true statement. It is false. And let me give you a picture as to what's so bad about it. So the deal about this is that this line that represents true p does not move around. It is the answer and it stays put. It's all those other intervals that are just kind of like, because of sampling variability, are spread out around it. So because of that, you cannot say there's a chance the real answer is in your interval, because that kind of implies that it might be in your interval or it might not be in your interval. And so that kind of says that the true answer is moving around or has the ability to move around. It doesn't. It is fact. It doesn't move. It's your intervals that are moving around. So essentially, the thing that we have to say is this. If I can get this little cover down. Right here. We got this right here. Here's where we are. So true P doesn't change. That's what that statement says. True P does not move around. This should be about if your interval contains true P, not about true P being in your interval. That's so weird to think about and tricky. It's kind of like which comes first, the chicken or the egg, I guess. Okay, so true P, we don't talk about the true P being in your interval. We talk about if your interval contains true P. So which comes first, true P or your interval? True P. True P is there. It's what, then you take your P hat and you make an interval. So true P comes first. So that's the catch there. All right. So the next statement says this. I like to close this up. Let me do that. Let me pull this back down here because I like to have it covered so we can see better. Okay, here's the next one. C. If this procedure were repeated many times, approximately 95% of the sample proportions, so that's saying 95% of all the other P hats are in your interval. Okay, but that's 44 to 55%. So let's look at a picture of it. I have an interval right here. This is the interval that I had made last week. That statement is saying 95% of all of the other P hats. So 95% of all of these other P hats that could possibly be made ever. All of the P hats are falling in my interval. Is that what a confidence interval, the correct interpretation of interval? Heck no. Because what if I had been an outlier? Like this one was a really good example. Here was an outlier interval. Are you telling me you can say, what happens if this was the interval that you had gotten? Can you say 95% of all of these P hats are in your interval? No. It's not about other samples being in your sample result. Okay. So that's what's wrong with that one. So, and then it won't move down. Bummer. Just do this. Intervals are not about other P hats being in it. Intervals are not about other samples or other intervals or other P hats or other things being in your sample results. Yours could be an outlier. Okay? Now, look at statement D. D says 95% of the sample proportions of voters, that's the P hats, will be between 44% and 50.5%. I was kind of thinking that pretty much is saying the exact same thing as the statement above it, right? So it's the same thing as C. It's still not about P hats being in your interval. Okay, the last one, E. If this, is this the last one? Is E the last one or is there another? Okay, there's another one after E. So E says, if this procedure were repeated many times, okay, if this procedure were repeated many times, then 95% of the resulting intervals would capture the true proportion of voters in favor of presidential Pete. If this procedure were repeated many times, so think all of those intervals, 95% of the resulting intervals would capture the true proportion, population proportion of it. So what do you think about that? That sounds like confidence level, right? With one exception. There's one little teeny tiny detail that is important that's left out. Whenever we sing our little song, let's say 95%, 95%. Is it of any intervals that you make? Any intervals that you make? No. You have common denominator stuff going on. It's 95% of the 95% confidence intervals. So this would be true if it said 95% of all 95% confidence intervals. It is not 95% of any old willy-nilly intervals because you cannot mix and match. You can't have some 80% and some 90% and some 95%. Okay? So again, the song doesn't say 95% 95% of any old interval that you make. No, it says of all 95%, 95% intervals of confidence, they contain the truth. Okay, so next F says, we are 95% confident that the sample proportion, and when it says the sample proportion, it means that one that you got, my p hat. So I am 95% confident that my p hat of voters in favor of presidential Pete is contained in my interval of 0.444 to 0.505. What do you think about that? Am I 95% confident that my p hat is in my interval? No. How did I make my interval? How's the start of your interval? Yeah. I make my interval with p hat, and then I go plus or minus that margin of error. And that's how I get the interval. So how confident am I that my p hat's in my interval? Yeah, pretty much 100%. So because if I made my interval with my p hat, then heck yeah, my p hat is in my interval because I made my interval with my p hat. Okay? So these are just so intensely, you know, subtle and very detail-oriented words about samples being in the intervals and all that kind of stuff. All right. So that's the end of what I wanted to go over with you. I can tell you that there's not really these subtleties of wording on your quiz that you're going to have tomorrow, but nevertheless, I still need to go over it. You have this as the next page in your packet, and this is in your packet just, this has 25 intervals, and 24 of those 25 intervals captured the true proportion of teenagers that go to movies on Friday. So this is because you don't have that picture of what we did on the board. So this is in here just for your benefit. And then you, now I'm going to come around and stamp you on pages 5 and 6. That was one assignment you did. Pages 9, 10, and 11, that was the other assignment. And then this past weekend you did 12, 16, and 17. And then today you need to finish that panic model that's missing on page 18 and do the warm-up on page 19, and we will we'll go over all of that and quiz tomorrow. Okay, we'll go over all of that and quiz tomorrow.